It is clear we do not want to defend Ortona decisively, but the English have made it appear as important as Rome. These were not the words of a junior staff officer venting in a bunker. They were not a line scribbled by a propagandist trying to manage German public opinion. They were the words of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Commander-in-Chief South, the most senior German soldier in Italy, spoken in a private telephone conversation in the final days of December 1943. They were captured for history because the 10th Army War Diary recorded them, and because Allied intelligence officers later found that diary among the wreckage of the Reich and translated it line by line. For most of the war, Kesselring kept his composure. The Allies called him Smiling Albert. His own troops called him Uncle Albert. Both nicknames captured the same trait, the disarming optimism of a field marshal who believed almost any battle could be won by holding ground long enough. He was the optimist of the German High Command, the man who told Adolf Hitler that Italy could be held south of Rome for at least 6 months, the man who believed that ground could be traded for blood and time on terms favourable to the Reich. But on a small Adriatic port the size of a Canadian county town, Kesselring lost that composure. He told the temporary 10th Army commander, General Joachim Lemelsen, that the situation could not be justified. He complained about the press. He complained about a battalion held too far back. He complained, in effect, about a trap that he himself had helped to build, and that the Canadians of the First Canadian Infantry Division were now closing around the elite paratroopers of his finest infantry division. Why? Why would a field marshal who had commanded Luftflotte II in the Battle of Britain, who had run the Luftwaffe campaigns over Poland and France, who had managed the entire Mediterranean theatre for 2 years, allow himself to be drawn into a street fight over a town he privately believed should never have been defended at all? Why would the German 10th Army commit its irreplaceable 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the so-called Green Devils, to a meat grinder along 3 narrow medieval streets, when Kesselring himself had said the place was not worth defending decisively? And what does the answer to that question reveal, not just about Ortona, but about how the German High Command came to view the Canadians who fought them there? The answer is not in the propaganda speeches of Joseph Goebbels. It is not in the official communiques pinned to bulletin boards in Berlin. The answer is in a captured 10th Army telephone log, in the diary of a young paratrooper combat engineer named Karl Bayerlein, in the after-action reports filed by Major General Christopher Vokes, and in the silences of Kesselring's own post-war memoirs, where the name Ortona almost never appears, even though the battle there shaped the rest of the campaign in Italy. To understand what Kesselring privately said about the Canadians at Ortona, we must walk through the rain-soaked olive groves of the Moro River. We must climb the cratered approach to Casa Berardi. We must follow the men of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment as they punch through plaster walls with hammers and demolition charges, room by room, building by building, until a small Italian port had become a private nightmare for one of the most decorated commanders in the German army. Before we step into Ortona itself, we have to put aside what most people imagine when they hear the word Canadian in 1943. The modern world remembers Canada through a peacekeeping lens, a country of polite diplomacy and cautious reform. The Canada that landed on the eastern coast of Sicily on July 10, 1943, and then fought its way up the Italian peninsula through the autumn rains, was a different country. It was a country of just over 11 million people that had volunteered nearly 1 million for service. It was a country whose Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, had agonized for years over the political question of conscription, but whose soldiers, almost without exception in 1943, were volunteers. The First Canadian Infantry Division, the formation that would meet Kesselring's paratroopers at Ortona, had been training in Britain since December 1939. By the time it landed in the Mediterranean, it had been hardening for 3.5 years, longer than the entire active life of most American infantry units. And the Germans had already noticed. Kesselring himself had filed a report from Sicily in July 1943, just days after the Canadians fought their first major action of the war at Valguanera. In that report, the Field Marshal told Berlin that he had identified troops trained for fighting in the mountains, troops the German staff officers were calling the Mountain Boys, and that they probably belonged to the 1st Canadian Division. It was not effusive praise. It was the cool, clinical observation of a professional soldier noticing that something had shifted on his battlefield. But it was the first time in the war that a German field marshal had singled out the Canadians by name in a strategic communication. By the time those same Canadians arrived on the Adriatic coast that December, the Mountain Boys had become something more dangerous. They had become an experienced division, blooded across 200 miles of Sicilian and southern Italian terrain, commanded by veterans, and supported by Canadian gunners whose doctrine owed much to the counter-battery work their fathers had pioneered at Vimy Ridge a generation earlier. The road to Ortona ran through mud. By late November 1943, the Allied armies in Italy had reached a series of fortified river lines that the German engineers had been preparing for months. Field Marshal Kesselring had personally promised Hitler, in a meeting that month, that he would hold the Allies south of Rome on what was being called the Gustav Line, with a forward defensive belt named the Bernhardt Line, running across the Italian boot from the Garigliano in the west to the Adriatic in the east. He believed it. He had 2 armies in Italy under his command, the 10th Army on the front line and the 14th in reserve. He had fortified the rivers, blown the bridges, mined the approaches, and stockpiled ammunition. The Adriatic flank of his line ran through a small river called the Moro, just south of Ortona. He thought it would slow the 8th Army for the rest of the winter. What he did not anticipate was the speed with which the First Canadian Infantry Division, freshly placed under the command of Major General Christopher Vokes, would force the crossings. On the night of December 5, 1943, Canadian battalions waded across the Moro under driving rain. The river had risen 6 feet in 24 hours, sweeping out the British 8th Army's pontoon bridge upstream on the Sangro. Conditions were catastrophic. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, all crossed within hours of one another, fighting up the muddy north bank against entrenched defenders of the German 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. By December 9, the Canadians held a precarious bridgehead. By December 14, that bridgehead had become a breakthrough, and the breakthrough had a name that the German 10th Army would write into its war diary with rising alarm. That name was Casa Berardi. Casa Berardi was a small cluster of stone farm buildings on a low ridge west of the road that ran into Ortona. Whoever held it controlled the western approach to a junction that the soldiers had nicknamed Cider Crossroads. The Royal 22nd Regiment, the famous Vendus of Quebec, were given the job. C Company, under the command of Captain Paul Triquet, started the attack on the morning of December 14 with roughly 80 effectives and a small group of Sherman tanks from C Squadron of the Ontario Regiment. By midday, his company had been reduced to 50 men and 1 officer, and by the time the position was taken in the late afternoon, Triquet had 2 sergeants and 15 men still on their feet. 4 German tanks had been destroyed. The Germans had counterattacked repeatedly. Triquet had walked among his men with his rifles slung, encouraging them in plain French. When his soldiers said they could not lift their heads because of enemy fire, he answered, "Never mind them, they cannot shoot." When the Germans appeared on every side of the position, he told his men there was only one safe place, and that was on the objective. The London Gazette of March 6 of 1944 recorded these words in his official Victoria Cross citation, the first awarded to a Canadian in the Italian campaign. The watchword that passed through his survivors as night fell was a phrase from Verdun, the battle their father's generation had not fought in but had read about in newspapers a quarter-century earlier. They will not pass. The German reaction to the loss of Casa Berardi is where Kesselring's private comments enter the historical record. The 10th Army War Diary for the night of December 14 records that the situation on the Adriatic was, in the staff officer's German, very tense. Reserves were committed. The last available battalions were thrown into the line. Colonel Ludwig Heilmann, the commander of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, told his superiors that the tactic of forward defence at the Moro had to be abandoned. He believed that even now one ought to change tactics. The 10th Army staff agreed. They began moving the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division of General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich into the line. Heydrich's paratroopers were the elite of the German army in Italy. They had fought at Crete and at the Sangro. They were rated by the Allies as the best infantry that the Germans had on the peninsula, a judgment that Field Marshal Harold Alexander, the senior Allied commander in the Mediterranean, would later put into writing in his post-war dispatches. They were now being committed to defend a town that Field Marshal Kesselring privately believed should never have been defended at all. Why was it being defended? The answer is in two pressures that converged on Kesselring's headquarters in the third week of December. The first pressure was political. On December 24, 1943, an order arrived directly from Hitler. Ortona was to be held at all costs. The order bypassed the usual chain of command and went straight to General Heydrich. The second pressure was the global press. Allied war correspondents had reached the Canadian sector. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reporter Matthew Hulton was filing dispatches every night by shortwave from a forward command post. The British correspondent Christopher Buckley was in the rubble. An Associated Press dispatch, carried by the New York Times on Christmas Day, 1943, brought home the phrase that would haunt the German High Command. For some unknown reason, the dispatch said, the Germans were trying to stage a miniature Stalingrad in hapless Ortona. Once that comparison reached the global wires, withdrawal became a propaganda defeat that neither Hitler nor Goebbels would tolerate. Kesselring understood the trap immediately. He had not chosen to fight at Ortona. He had been chosen. His private reaction is preserved in the 10th Army War Diary, captured by the Allies in 1945, and used by the Canadian official historian Colonel Gerald Nicholson in his 1956 volume on the campaign. In a phone call to General Lemelsen, Kesselring said the line that opens this story, "The English have made it appear as important as Rome." He repeated the same idea in slightly different words when authorizing what he hoped would be a quiet, gradual withdrawal. "We do not want to defend Ortona decisively." He told Lemelsen that the enemy always seemed to find the boundaries between German formations, and that the devil himself must know how the Allies always found out where they were. What he did not know, and what Allied intelligence would not declassify until the 1970s, was that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading the German command's signals in near real time through a program codenamed Ultra. The devil was not finding the boundaries. The mathematicians at Bletchley were. And then, on Christmas Day, came the most revealing exchange in the entire German telephone log. Lemelsen, watching his casualty returns climb, told Kesselring directly that the battle was costing too much. He used a phrase that no junior officer would dare to send up the chain in writing. He said that it cost so much in blood that it could not be justified. Kesselring agreed. He could not order a withdrawal because Hitler had personally forbidden it, but he could complain about the deployment. He told Lemelsen, in words recorded that same Christmas Day in the war diary of 76th Panzer Corps, that the mistake was that 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment had been kept too far back. He was talking about a Fallschirmjäger battalion that had been held in reserve at a coastal village called Torre Mucchia, 3 miles up the coast from Ortona. The Canadians were grinding through the town, building by building, and the German reserve was sitting in the wrong place. 2 days earlier, on December 23, Kesselring had also vented to Lemelsen about another political headache. He said he had received what he called a terrific blast from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was demanding that the Hermann Göring Division, which had been split between two coasts, be reunited as a single force. Kesselring had no spare manpower to reunite anything. He was holding a line that was bleeding to death because Hitler had decided a small port had to be held at all costs. This was Kesselring's private war at Ortona. It was not a war about Canadian fighting qualities. It was a war about being trapped by his own success at convincing Hitler that Italy could be held forever, and being trapped by the global press that had made Ortona into a symbol that had to be defended for reasons that had nothing to do with terrain or supply lines. He never wrote a single sentence praising the Canadians by name in his Ortona communications, but the silences were louder than the words. He committed his finest division to stop them. He admitted that the cost could not be justified. He admitted that the situation had developed in ways he could not control. And those admissions, preserved on a captured telephone log, are the closest thing we will ever have to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring telling the world what he thought of the Canadians at Ortona. While Kesselring was complaining on the phone, the Canadians were inventing a new kind of urban warfare. The town of Ortona was small, perhaps 8 blocks long and 3 blocks deep along the spine of the medieval ridge. Its main street, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, ran from the railway station up through a central square called the Piazza Municipale, and then north toward the Cathedral of St. Thomas. The Germans had spent the second week of December fortifying every building. They had collapsed houses to channel attackers into killing zones. They had cut firing positions through party walls. They had stretched ropes across rooftops so that paratroopers could move from house to house without ever showing themselves on the street. They had wired booby traps into doorways and stairwells. The first day the Loyal Edmonton Regiment entered the town, on December 20, they discovered what awaited them. A Sherman tank moving up the Corso was hit by an anti-tank round. Within minutes, the lead infantry section was pinned. By nightfall, a single block had cost more men than an entire morning of open country fighting on the Moro. It was here that a young officer of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment named Bill Longhurst made a decision that changed the history of urban warfare. He looked up, and he noticed that the row houses of Ortona shared common interior walls. If he could blast through the upper floor of one house, he reasoned, he could enter the next house at the second story, drop grenades down the stairwell, and clear the building from the top down before the Germans could mount a defense. He requested a beehive charge of plastic explosive from his pioneer section. He placed it against a shared wall on an upper floor. The explosion punched a hole the size of a man. The first assault team went through. The technique worked. By the second day, the Loyal Edmontons and the Seaforth Highlanders, working in pairs, were doing this systematically across whole blocks. They called it mouse-holing. They were not the first to think of it. British Army training films had demonstrated the principle in 1941. Soviet defenders had used the technique in the rubble of Stalingrad a year earlier. But Ortona was the first time the Allies put it into sustained large-scale combat use in Western Europe, and the Canadians made it famous. The lessons learned reports they wrote during and after the battle, preserved today in the United Kingdom National Archives, fed directly into the Allied training manuals for street fighting that prepared the troops who would fight at Caen, at Aachen, and along the road to Berlin. The fighting itself was not heroic in any conventional sense. It was a craft of shovels, hammers, plastic explosives, and short-range automatic weapons. A Canadian infantryman would crawl up to a wall, place a charge, take cover, and then storm through the gap with a Thompson submachine gun and a bandolier of grenades. He would clear room by room, top floor down, throwing a grenade into each space before entering. The fighting at the Cathedral of St. Thomas, which dominated the town's northern quarter, became infamous. Canadian tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment had to fire high-explosive rounds into the cathedral dome to deny it to German observers. Canadian tank crews developed a refined two-round technique. They would fire one explosive round to make a breach in a wall, and then a second round of a different type to kill anyone who had taken cover behind it. The Canadian artillery, working from positions behind the ridge, fired tens of thousands of rounds in support, walking shells along the streets just ahead of the advancing infantry. The official Canadian war artist, Charles Comfort, watching from a rooftop, later wrote that what he saw was a medieval battle in its close-quarter violence, men groping through suffocating dust and smoke, stumbling over upturned furniture and debris, struggling breathlessly in nightmare darkness, felling, clubbing, blasting, and shooting it out. On December 26 came the worst single incident of the battle. A platoon of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment entered a building on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele in pursuit of withdrawing Germans. The building had been wired with demolition charges. As the Canadians spread through it, the paratroopers detonated the charges and brought the entire structure down on top of them. The platoon was annihilated. Lance Corporal Roy Boyd was the sole survivor pulled out alive, buried in the rubble for 3.5 days before rescue parties reached him on December 30. His story would later be told and retold by veterans, but the broader lesson was absorbed in real time. By that night, every Loyal Edmonton platoon was using a forward observer to clear a building before entry, and every breach was being supported by a satchel charge thrown ahead of the assault team. The booby trap had cost lives. It would not cost them again. On the German side, a young paratrooper combat engineer named Karl Bayerlein, a sapper in the 1st Fallschirmjäger Battalion of Heydrich's division, was keeping a diary. After the war, his diary was acquired by the Canadian War Museum, translated by a researcher named Alex Macquarie, edited by Dr. Dean Oliver, and published in 1999 in the journal Canadian Military History. The published account combines his contemporaneous wartime entries with a longer summary that he wrote up from those entries in the early 1990s. Bayerlein recorded the daily routine of paratroopers under siege. He recorded that civilian motorcycle dispatch riders brought roast pork and oranges to forward positions on Christmas Day. He recorded that on December 27 the order finally came down to clear the city. He recorded that the withdrawal began at 10 in the evening that same day, that it followed the rail line out to the north, and that an attempt to demolish a railway tunnel as the paratroopers retreated failed because their mines lacked proper insulation. The paratroopers had practiced the demolition in training. They had not practiced it in driving rain after 8 days without sleep. As the Germans pulled out, they left behind a small Christmas tree in the railway tunnel with a note addressed to the Canadians who would find it. The note, translated, said in effect that the paratroopers were sorry they could not stay to put mistletoe on, but they would make it hot for the Canadians up in the hills. In a post-war reflection added to his diary in the early 1990s, Bayerlein looked back on Ortona and wrote a sentence that has become famous in German Fallschirmjäger memory. "The enemy gained a destroyed city," he wrote. "We left undefeated." It was a post-war interpretation, not a contemporaneous note, but it captures what the survivors of Heydrich's division wanted to believe about the battle. The senior German commanders inside the cauldron knew better than Bayerlein could have known at his level. Colonel Ludwig Heilmann of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, the man who had told the 10th Army staff that the tactic of forward defense had to change, was so confident that reinforcements would arrive in time that he left for home leave in Germany shortly after the Ortona line stabilized. He returned to find his regiment a shadow of what he had left. General Heydrich, the divisional commander, would later be moved with his entire formation to the Casino front in February 1944, where the same paratroopers would defend the monastery and the surrounding hills against 4 successive Allied offensives. The Canadians who had ground them down at Ortona would not see them again. By the time Heydrich's division collapsed at the Hitler line in May 1944, it was a different formation, refilled with replacements who had not been at Ortona, commanded by junior officers who had never seen the Loyal Edmonton Regiment work its way through a wall with a beehive charge. The veterans of Ortona, the men whose voices fill Bayerlein's diary, were mostly already dead, wounded, or scattered. What the Canadians knew, and what Bayerlein could not yet acknowledge, was that the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had been gutted. The casualty returns from 76th Panzer Corps for the 9 days that span Ortona record 68 killed, 159 wounded, 205 missing, and 23 sick, for a total of 455. Canadian troops counted over 100 unburied German dead in the buildings and streets of the town, suggesting that many of the missing were in fact dead. By the end of December, every battalion of the 1st Parachute Division had been reduced to the strength of a single company. The 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had borne the brunt of the Moro fighting before the paratroopers arrived, had been so badly mauled that General Vaux, in his after-action summary, said the Canadians had smashed it. He said they had given the 1st German Parachute Division a mauling that it would long remember. The cost on the Canadian side was equally staggering. Across the entire Bloody December campaign of 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division recorded approximately 502 killed and roughly 2,339 total casualties. Around 4,800 men had to be evacuated for casualties, sickness, or what the medical staff were now openly calling battle exhaustion. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment lost 172 men in Ortona alone, 63 of them killed. The Seaforth Highlanders lost 103, 41 of them killed. The civilian population of Ortona, trapped in basements and cellars throughout the battle, lost approximately 1,300 dead, women, men, children, the elderly, an Italian community sacrificed to a battle that their own government had not chosen. It was inside this cauldron, on December 25, that the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada did something that has entered Canadian national memory. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson, ordered a Christmas dinner for the entire battalion, served in shifts, in the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, which stood on the southern edge of the town near the Seaforth lines. The quartermaster, Captain Cameron, organized the menu: soup, roast pork with applesauce, mashed potatoes and gravy, cauliflower, Christmas pudding, mince pies, chocolate, oranges, apples, nuts, candies, cigarettes, 1 bottle of beer for each man. The companies rotated in from the front line in turn. Lieutenant Wilf Gildersleeve, the Seaforth signals officer, played the church organ. The padre, Roy Durnford, looked at the rows of unshaven, mud-caked faces and said gently, "Well, At last I have got you all in church." A future Victoria Cross winner named Ernest Smith, then 29 years old, told his section that he did not know what was going through the minds of the people in charge, but that men were going to be killed going to that dinner, and others were going to die coming back from it. He was right. As one platoon left the church at 7 that evening, a German shell hit the company group on the road. Men who had eaten roast pork in a church an hour earlier were carried back to the regimental aid post with shrapnel wounds. Some did not survive the night. The dinner was real. The grief was real. The famous photograph that is sometimes labelled as taken inside the church on Christmas Day was, according to recent research by historians at the Canadian Film and Photo Unit, probably taken at divisional headquarters at Marina di San Vito, not at the church itself. The dinner happened. The image in many books is from a different room. To understand why the Germans came to fear what the Canadians did at Ortona, it helps to compare it with what other Allied formations were doing along the same 800-mile peninsula in the same months. The American Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark Clark was advancing up the western coast, fighting for crossings of the Volturno and approaching what would become the meat grinder at Casino. American operations were defined by abundance. The United States deployed industrial-scale artillery, immense engineering resources, and fighter bombers in numbers no other Allied army possessed. German commanders feared American firepower. They respected American logistics. But in their internal reports, the same German commanders often described American infantry as relying on those advantages rather than on tactical maneuver. General Friedrich von Senger und Etterlin, who commanded the German 14th Panzer Corps at Casino, wrote in his post-war memoir that the American formations he faced were well supplied and conventional, and that they did not improvise as readily as the French Goumiers or the Polish corps that arrived later in the campaign. The British contribution along the same front was different again. The British Eighth Army, to which the First Canadian Infantry Division was attached at Ortona, had been fighting almost continuously since its formation in the desert in 1941. Its troops were veterans, its staff officers were skilled, but the British Army of 1943 was tired. The Empire was running out of infantry replacements. The doctrine that General Bernard Montgomery brought to Italy emphasized careful preparation, set-piece battles, and the conservation of manpower. German commanders respected the British soldiers' discipline. They did not, on the whole, fear British improvisation. They knew Montgomery's army would advance methodically, and they could plan accordingly. The Canadians, in the German operational picture, occupied a different category. They were not yet exhausted. They had been training for years. They had absorbed the technical doctrine of the British Army, but they fought with an aggression that the British staff colleges had been trying to discourage in their own units since the bloodletting of the Somme. When General von Viertinghoff resumed command of the German 10th Army after Christmas 1943, he and his staff were left to assess what they had just been through. Their own daily reports for the period of December 5 to 28 repeatedly used language about Canadian formations that was reserved in earlier months for the New Zealanders and the Indians. The Canadians did not pause where the doctrine said they should pause. They did not consolidate when consolidation was the safer choice. They kept moving, even at appalling cost, even after they had taken casualties that should, by every textbook standard, have stopped the advance. And the German reports could not hide their respect, even if Kesselring himself never expressed it in writing. The most thorough German written assessment of the Allied formations that fought in Italy comes from the post-war memoir of General Friedrich von Senger und Etterlin, the commander of the 14th Panzer Corps at Casino, published in 1960 as Krieg in Europa and translated into English in 1963 as Neither Fear Nor Hope. Von Senger was a Rhodes Scholar, a Catholic conservative, and a careful writer. He distinguished sharply between the Allied formations he faced. The French Goumiers, under General Alphonse Juin, he described as the most adaptable mountain troops on the Allied side. The New Zealanders, under General Bernard Freyberg, he respected for their stubbornness. The Polish Second Corps, under General Władysław Anders, when it arrived in 1944, he singled out for the unmatched aggression and personal motivation of its riflemen. About American forces he was politely critical. About the British Eighth Army he was institutional. He had relatively little to say about the Canadians directly, because his sector at Casino did not face them at Ortona. But the broader German operational record, distilled in Army Headquarters Report No. 18, written by Dr. A. G. Steiger of the Canadian Army Historical Section in the late 1940s, drew a clear conclusion. The German 10th Army, in its captured daily reports and in its telephone exchanges, treated the Canadian formation opposite it with a respect that the propaganda apparatus in Berlin was never permitted to acknowledge. Why the Canadians were like this in the winter of 1943? The answer is a combination of three things. The first was experience. The First Canadian Infantry Division had now been in continuous combat since July, longer than most American formations. Its officers had been weeded by Sicily and southern Italy, and the survivors were the ones who had passed the ruthless test of small unit leadership under fire. The second was leadership. The brigade commanders who fought at Ortona, men like Bert Hofmeister of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, would within months be running divisions of their own. Hofmeister was the kind of officer who walked the front line, who knew his company commanders by their first names, and who refused to let his men feel that they had been forgotten in a backwater theatre. The third was political. Canada was a small nation fighting for international recognition. Its government wanted Canadian formations to be visible, to be entrusted with high-profile objectives, to demonstrate to the world that Canada was a partner and not a colony. That national ambition filtered down to the rifleman in the alley. He was not just fighting for the Loyal Edmonton Regiment or the Seaforth Highlanders. He was fighting for a young country that had something to prove. By December 28, 1943, the town of Ortona was in Canadian hands. The Germans had withdrawn during the night of December 27, slipping out along the rail line in the rain. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division pulled back to a new line on the river called the Triquet, where the Adriatic front would ossify for the next 4 months. General Heydrich, the German divisional commander, would receive the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross on February 5 of 1944, with a citation that explicitly named Ortona as the action for which he was being decorated. From the German side, the battle had ended in tactical withdrawal, but in honourable defence. From the Canadian side, the battle had ended in the capture of an objective and the destruction of the enemy facing them, but at a cost that General Vaux himself, in his memoir written 4 decades later, called the moment when everything before Ortona became, by comparison, a fairy tale. The chain of command on the Allied side was already shifting even as the last shots were being fired in the streets. On December 23, while the Loyal Edmontons and the Seaforths were still grinding through Ortona, General Bernard Montgomery had been informed that he was to leave Italy and take command of the 21st Army Group for the coming invasion of Normandy. Montgomery would depart 8th Army on December 30, 2 days after the fall of Ortona. His successor, General Sir Oliver Leese, took command in early January 1944 and inherited a battered 8th Army that could not resume major offensive action. The Adriatic front went static along a line of small rivers, the Riccio and the Arieli, where the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was joined by the newly formed First Canadian Corps under General Henry Crérard, with the addition of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division. The 1st Canadian Corps offensive of the new year, a probing attack along the Arieli on January 17, cost 185 casualties for almost no ground gained. The men who had taken Ortona understood, in a way the politicians at home could not, that they had reached the end of their offensive capacity for the winter. What did travel out of Ortona, however, was the doctrine. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, and the Three Rivers Regiment all submitted detailed after-action reports in the weeks following the battle, and those reports were collated and translated, where useful, into British training pamphlets preserved today in the United Kingdom National Archives under file references, War Office 232/17 and War Office 32/11458. They carried titles like Experiences from Fighting in Ortona, Canadian Deductions from Ortona Street Fighting, and further notes on house and street fighting. Those pamphlets were read in 1944 by Allied infantry officers preparing for the urban combat ahead. The mouse-holing technique, the use of beehive charges on shared interior walls, the rotation of small assault teams from top floor down through the structure of a building, all of it was now part of the Allied infantry curriculum. Field Marshal Kesselring, in his own memoir published in 1953, devoted only a few short paragraphs to the Adriatic fighting of December 1943. He treated it as a delaying action, part of his broader narrative of holding the winter line. He did not name the Canadian division. He did not mention Ortona by name in his English-language memoirs index. The silence is, in its way, the most eloquent testimony of all. The man who in 1947 would stand trial in Venice for war crimes related to the Adriatic Caves massacre, who would be sentenced to death and then have his sentence commuted, who would write thousands of pages about his career as a soldier, simply could not bring himself to write at length about the small Italian port where his finest division had been ground down by the mountain boys he had first noticed in Sicily 6 months earlier. So we return to the question that we began with. What did Field Marshal Albert Kesselring privately say about the Canadians at Ortona? The honest archival answer is that he said almost nothing about them directly. He never wrote, in any document that has survived to be examined by historians, a sentence praising their tactical methods, their fighting spirit, or their results. But what he did say, in those captured telephone calls, is in some ways more revealing than any speech of admiration could have been. He said that the English had made Ortona appear as important as Rome. He acknowledged that the cost in blood could not be justified. He said the enemy always found the boundaries between his formations. He said the mistake was that a reserve battalion had been kept too far back. He authorized the use of his finest division, the paratroopers of Adriatic, to stop an advance that should not have needed stopping. And then, when the dust settled, he stayed silent. For the Canadians who survived Ortona, the meaning of the battle would harden over decades into a quiet pride. Captain Paul Triquet would live until 1980, the only Canadian Victoria Cross winner of the Italian campaign before Ernest Smith would earn his own at the crossing of the Savio in October 1944. Major General Christopher Vokes would go on to command the 4th Canadian Armoured Division in northwest Europe. Brigadier Bert Hofmeister would rise to command the 5th Canadian Armoured Division in Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson would survive the war and live until the 1980s, returning to Ortona for the 40th and 50th anniversaries to walk the streets where his men had eaten Christmas dinner under fire. The survivors did not need Kesselring to praise them. They had the testimony of their own padres, their own chaplains, their own correspondents, and above all, the testimony of the town itself. Ortona today still marks December 27 each year. The streets still bear plaques to the regiments that took them. The Cathedral of St. Thomas, rebuilt after the war, holds an annual mass for the Canadian dead. The simple stone marker at the Moro River Cemetery records the names of the men who fell in 1943, men who never came home from the 8 medieval blocks that gave Field Marshal Albert Kesselring the most expensive Christmas of his career. What endures from this story is not a slogan, it is a measurement. The Canadian sacrifice at Ortona, 2,300 casualties in a single division across a single month of fighting, was the price of breaking through a fortified Adriatic front against the elite of the German army. The German sacrifice was the destruction of the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division as a fighting force and the gutting of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. The Italian civilian sacrifice was 1,300 dead in a town of 10,000. The strategic result was small. Ortona itself proved of little strategic value. The 8th Army did not reach Pescara that winter. The German front along the Adriatic stabilized, but the operational lesson was unmistakable, and it travelled. By the time the Canadian Corps fought its way through the Hitler Line in the Liri Valley in May 1944, the Germans facing them had been told what to expect. By the time the Canadians landed at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, the urban warfare manuals issued to British and Canadian formations in Normandy carried sections directly drawn from the Loyal Edmonton lessons of December 20 to 27, 1943. If there is a final word on what Kesselring privately said about the Canadians at Ortona, it should be the one delivered, not by Kesselring, but by the man on the other side of the line. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in Italy, looked back on the German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the same paratroopers who had defended Ortona, and wrote that no other troops in the world but German parachute troops could have stood up to such an ordeal and then gone on fighting with such ferocity. The Canadians had broken those troops. They had broken them in 8 days of close-quarter fighting, with shovels, hammers, beehive charges, and tank shells fired into cathedral domes. They had done it under the eyes of the global press, in front of war correspondents who broadcast their progress nightly to North America. They had done it on Christmas, between courses of roast pork served in a candlelit church. and they had done it well enough that the most decorated German Field Marshal in the Mediterranean, in his most candid moment, did not have the language to describe what had been done to him. He had only complaints, exasperation, and silence. That silence, captured in the war diary of a defeated army and translated patiently by a Canadian official historian a decade later, is the closest thing to an answer that history has preserved. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring did not call the Canadians wild men. He did not call them executioners. He did not call them anything at all. He simply admitted, in the closing days of 1943, that the cost of what they were doing to him could no longer be justified by any reasonable calculation of military advantage. And in the language of a German field marshal writing for his own war diary, that admission was as close to surrender as he had ever come.